Johnny Carson was the king of late night, but even kings have enemies. While most stars would have given anything to sit across from Carson's desk, some found themselves frozen out, never to return. What kind of behavior could get you banished by America's most beloved host? Was it arrogance, rivalry, or simply bad timing? Stick around, because the guests we're about to reveal didn't just annoy Johnny, they pushed him past the breaking point in ways you won't believe. Charles Grodin. Few guests could make Carson visibly squirm, but Charles Grodin managed it. The actor and comedian had a style unlike anyone else, dry, combative, and intentionally awkward. When he appeared on the show, he didn't play nice. Instead, Grodin sparred with Carson, pretending to be offended, acting disinterested, and even accusing Johnny of not listening. Audiences weren't sure if it was a comedy bit or genuine hostility. Carson himself often looked uncomfortable. He was a master of conversation, but Grodin's deadpan interruptions threw off his rhythm. At one point, Grodin even told Johnny that his questions were lazy and boring. You could see Carson's jaw tighten as he tried to hold back irritation. The truth? Grodin was doing a performance, parodying the traditional late-night interview. But Carson wasn't always in on the joke, and behind the scenes he reportedly made it clear that he didn't enjoy the chaos. While Grodin wasn't permanently banned, his invites became far less frequent after pushing Johnny's patience too many times. In hindsight, Grodin's antics were brilliant performance art, but Carson preferred guests who made him look good, not ones who challenged his authority on his own stage. For Carson, Grodin crossed a line, and that line cost him dearly. Buddy Rich. When Buddy Rich sat down with Carson, fireworks were guaranteed, but not the good kind. Known as one of the greatest drummers in jazz history, Rich also had a reputation for being arrogant, abrasive, and downright hostile. Stories of him verbally tearing apart his own band members were legendary, and that fiery personality carried into Carson's studio. Rich frequently clashed with Doc Severinsen, Carson's bandleader. Their arguments about tempo and style sometimes spilled over in front of the cameras. Carson, who prided himself on keeping the mood light, hated when behind-the-scenes drama crept into his show. Guests were supposed to entertain, not create tension with the house band. During one infamous visit, Rich dismissed questions with curt answers and then launched into a tirade about musicians who couldn't keep up with him. Carson's smile grew thinner with every word. By the end of the segment, the audience was laughing more at Johnny's forced politeness than at Rich's supposed charm. After repeated headaches, Carson quietly phased him out. Buddy Rich could still sell out concert halls, but his abrasive style clashed with the carefully controlled environment Johnny maintained. If you couldn't play along with Carson's rules, you didn't get invited back. Rich learned that the hard way. Madonna. When Madonna burst onto the scene in the 1980s, she wasn't just pushing musical boundaries, she was pushing cultural ones. Bold, unfiltered, and often unpredictable, she was everything Carson both admired and feared in a guest. Her larger-than-life persona often threatened to overwhelm the set, and Johnny wasn't fond of being upstage. During one of her appearances, Madonna delivered answers dripping with sarcasm, playfully teasing Johnny in ways that bordered on mockery. While younger audiences cheered, Carson's loyal older viewers weren't so impressed. Behind the desk, Johnny forced a laugh, but insiders claimed he didn't enjoy the encounter. Carson valued guests who elevated the show without hijacking it. Madonna, however, had a habit of turning any stage into her own personal spotlight. Her unpredictable behavior, whether it was blunt remarks, edgy humor, or casual disregard for format, made producers nervous. Soon after, she wasn't asked back, with whispers that Carson himself didn't want to risk another runaway performance. Madonna, of course, hardly noticed. Her career skyrocketed, proving she didn't need late-night approval to dominate pop culture. For Carson, though, it was a reminder. He welcomed stars, but not if they made him look like a sidekick. With Madonna, that line was crossed, and the band hammer quietly dropped. Mr. T, by the mid-1980s, Mr. T was a cultural phenomenon. Thanks to the A-Team and his booming personality, he was everywhere. TV, movies, commercials, even breakfast cereal. But his signature mix of toughness and over-the-top bravado didn't exactly blend with Johnny Carson's more controlled brand of entertainment. When Mr. T appeared, he came in full force, loud, brash, and completely dominating the stage. Instead of answering questions, he often barked slogans, flexed his muscles, and played to the crowd. At one point, he even took control of the conversation, cutting Johnny off with his trademark one-liners. The audience roared, but Carson's smile was icy. For Johnny, the Tonight stage wasn't meant to be wrestled into submission. He liked strong personalities, but Mr. T's refusal to tone it down came off as disrespectful. Behind the scenes, staff members whispered that Carson found him exhausting. The host, who prided himself on calm, smooth interviews, didn't appreciate being drowned out by a human catchphrase machine. Mr. T remained a household name, but his time on Carson's show quickly ended. Johnny had made up his mind. He admired the character but didn't want the chaos. In the Carson universe, control mattered more than spectacle, and Mr. T lost his invite. Cher. Cher is known for saying what others only think, and that blunt honesty once landed her on Johnny Carson's bad side. While her actual feud is more closely tied to David Letterman, Johnny kept a careful eye on her unapologetic, sharp-tongued persona. When Cher appeared, she was charming, but there was always a risk she might deliver a comment that left Johnny squirming. Carson respected her as a superstar, but he disliked unpredictability that could damage the show's polished tone. Her reputation for firing off unfiltered remarks, especially the time she called another host an asshole on air, didn't sit well with Johnny's producers. Carson valued class, control, and just enough edge to keep audiences awake. Cher's fearless style went beyond that balance. According to crew members, Carson grew wary of inviting her too often, fearing she might say something that would cause backlash with his more conservative audience. Did Cher really care? Not at all. By the time Johnny cooled on her appearances, Cher was already conquering music, movies, and fashion. She didn't need late night to validate her. Still, her reduced presence on the show signaled Carson's preference for guests who stayed within his comfort zone. For Johnny, Cher was simply too much of a gamble. Don Rickles. Don Rickles and Johnny Carson had one of the strangest love-hate dynamics in television. On the surface, Rickles was a favorite guest. His rapid-fire insults and fearless comedy always drew laughs. But behind the desk, Johnny sometimes bristled at just how far Rickles was willing to go. The most famous moment came when Rickles filled in on a night when Carson wasn't there. While clowning around on set, he smashed Johnny's prized cigarette box, an item Carson kept at his desk for years. When Carson returned and discovered it, he was furious, not just at the prank, but at the lack of respect. Carson even stormed onto the set of Rickles' show, CPO Sharkey, during a live taping to confront him, demanding, "You broke my cigarette box." The exchange became legendary television, but insiders say Johnny never completely forgave him. While Rickles continued to appear, there were stretches where he mysteriously disappeared from the lineup. Carson had a long memory, and he didn't appreciate being made the butt of the joke without his permission. Rickles may have been the merchant of venom, but Johnny was the king, and the king made sure his crown stayed firmly in place. Wayne Newton. Wayne Newton wasn't just a singer, he was a Vegas institution. But when Carson started making jokes about Newton's masculinity and flamboyant style, things turned ugly. Newton didn't laugh it off. Instead, he took it personally. The tension boiled over when Newton allegedly confronted Carson privately, furious at being ridiculed in front of millions. Accounts vary, but one version claims Newton threatened Johnny, making it crystal clear he wouldn't tolerate the jokes. From that point on, his appearances became rare. Carson had poked fun at countless celebrities over the years, but most took it with a grin. Newton wasn't one of them. His pride and his image mattered too much. The feud left a lasting chill, and Carson's team stopped booking him regularly. Ironically, Newton's career continued to flourish in Vegas. He didn't need Carson's platform to stay relevant, but the incident revealed an important truth about Johnny. He loved to tease, but he didn't want to deal with the fallout if a star fought back too hard. In Newton's case, the joke wasn't funny anymore, and that meant the door quietly closed. Charles Nelson Riley. Charles Nelson Riley was a television staple, quick-witted, flamboyant, and always ready with a one-liner. But his larger-than-life personality didn't always mesh with Johnny Carson's controlled environment. Riley thrived on unpredictability, tossing out jokes that went in wild directions and often ignoring the planned questions altogether. Carson valued smooth, polished interview where he could guide the conversation. With Riley, guiding anything was nearly impossible. At times, Johnny could be seen forcing a grin as Riley went off on tangents, clearly annoyed that he had lost control of the segment. Behind the scenes, producers reportedly found him exhausting to manage. While audiences loved his campy, outrageous energy on shows like Match Game, Carson's team thought his antics risked alienating older viewers who preferred a calmer style of humor. As a result, Riley's appearances slowed to a crawl. He wasn't officially blacklisted, but invitations dried up, and it was clear Carson preferred guests who played within the lines. For Riley, the ban was less about scandal and more about fit. Carson wanted order, and Charles brought chaos. And chaos, no matter how funny, wasn't welcome for long. David Letterman? It might shock some people, but David Letterman, Carson's supposed heir, eventually found himself out of favor with the man he admired most. Early on, Johnny liked Letterman. He even pushed NBC to give him a late-night show, believing Dave was the future of television. But things soured when NBC chose Jay Leno to replace Carson instead of Letterman. Though the decision wasn't Johnny's, the fallout created distance between the two. Letterman felt betrayed by the network, and Carson disliked being dragged into the drama. By the time Carson retired, Letterman's appearances had all but vanished. Johnny wasn't one to engage in public feuds, but he was careful about keeping his distance from anything that might tarnish his carefully crafted exit. Letterman eventually built his own empire at CBS, but the silence between him and Carson spoke volumes. The ban wasn't about bad behavior. It was about the uncomfortable truth that even protégés could become rivals. Carson, ever protective of his legacy, chose to keep Letterman at arm's length rather than fan the flames of controversy. Dick Cavett. If there was one thing Johnny Carson hated, it was competition, and Dick Cavett, witty and intellectual, was just that. Cavett launched his own late-night show, which immediately drew comparisons to Carson's empire. The two weren't just hosts, they were rivals, battling for ratings and influence. When Cavett appeared on Carson's program, the tension was obvious. Both men were smart, both were funny, and both wanted to be the sharpest in the room. Carson, however, didn't enjoy sharing his stage with someone who could match him punch for punch. Once Cavett's show gained traction, Carson cut back on his invitations. The message was clear. Late night wasn't big enough for both of them. Carson's team wanted to protect their star, and giving Cavett airtime was like feeding the enemy. Cavett himself later admitted the rivalry made things awkward. While he respected Johnny, he also knew he posed a threat. For Carson, the solution was simple. Lock the door and keep the competition out. Cavett may have carved his own niche, but on Johnny's stage there was only room for one king. Red Fox. Red Fox, the groundbreaking star of Sanford and Son, was a comedy legend, but not one Johnny Carson was eager to keep around. Fox had a sharp edge to his humor, with punchlines that often tiptoed right up to the line of what censors could allow. For Carson, who had to balance mainstream audiences with network executives, that edge created constant anxiety. During one appearance, Fox riffed on social issues with a bluntness that made Carson visibly squirm. The audience laughed, but Carson's eyes darted nervously to the side, knowing the network wasn't thrilled. Fox wasn't just cracking jokes, he was challenging authority, and that didn't fit Carson's carefully controlled image of smooth entertainment. Behind the scenes, producers whispered that Carson found Fox too unpredictable. He wasn't the type to stick to pre-approved topics or play along with soft questions. He was going to say what he wanted, whether Carson liked it or not. As a result, Fox's invites dwindled. He wasn't officially blacklisted, but Carson made it clear he preferred comics who didn't make the censors sweat. Fox still thrived on sitcoms and stand-up stages, but his time in Carson's studio was cut short. For Johnny, one thing was certain. Edgy was fine, but not when it risked his empire. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. was a megastar, singer, dancer, actor, and member of the Rat Pack. On paper, he was the perfect Carson guest, but in practice, Davis could be overwhelming. His high-energy performances and larger-than-life personality often left Carson in the background, reduced to nodding while Sammy stole the show. Carson respected talent, but he didn't enjoy being overshadowed on his own stage. Audiences tuned in for Johnny first, and Sammy's tendency to dominate left the balance off. Insiders say Johnny quietly cooled on booking him too often, wary that Davis would turn every appearance into the Sammy Show. It didn't help that Sammy was closely linked to Frank Sinatra, someone Carson was already uneasy around. The Rat Pack carried power, swagger, and an aura that Carson didn't entirely trust. That tension meant Sammy wasn't welcomed with the same open arms as other stars of his era. Of course, Davis hardly noticed. His career spanned Broadway, film, and sold-out concerts, so skipping Carson's couch didn't slow him down. But the message was clear. If you were too big, too loud, or too commanding, Carson had no problem quietly closing the door. Sammy's absence proved that not even Rat Pack royalty was immune. Mort Sahl. Mort Sahl wasn't just a comedian, he was a political satirist who tore into the establishment with razor-sharp wit. His stand-up routines were filled with references to politicians, scandals, and controversial issues. While that style earned him a loyal fan base, it didn't always mesh with Carson's safer, Middle America brand of comedy. When Sahl appeared, his rapid-fire social commentary sometimes went over the heads of audiences who just wanted an easy laugh. Worse, Carson often looked uncomfortable, unsure how to respond without stepping into dangerous territory. Johnny preferred clever one-liners and playful banter, not fiery critiques of government policy. After a few appearances that left executives nervous, Sahl was quietly eased out of the rotation. Carson didn't need the risk. The ban wasn't personal, it was business. Late-night TV was built on charm and escapism, and Sahl was the opposite. Sahl's career suffered overall as America's appetite for political satire wavered in the 1970s, but his absence from Carson's stage was especially glaring. For Johnny, the decision was simple. Controversy might make headlines, but it didn't make comfortable television. Mort Sahl learned that even the sharpest wit could be dulled when the gatekeeper closed the door. Jackie Mason. Jackie Mason's run-ins with late-night television are infamous, and his fallout with Carson only added to the story. Mason was a brilliant comedian, known for his biting delivery and animated gestures. But one hand movement during a live show in the 1960s created a storm of trouble. While speaking on another network, Mason made a gesture that many interpreted as obscene. The controversy spread fast, and Carson, ever protective of his show's reputation, distanced himself immediately. Mason, once a promising guest, found himself essentially blacklisted from Johnny's program. Carson never explained the decision in detail, but those close to him said Johnny disliked being associated with performers who brought scandal into the studio. Whether or not Mason intended to offend, the perception was enough. For Mason, the ban was a crushing blow. Being cut off from Carson's massive audience slowed his momentum for years. Though he eventually revived his career with acclaimed one-man shows, the Carson fallout stuck to him like glue. It was a reminder that in Johnny's Chihuahuasum world, even a single misstep could close the door forever. Buddy Hackett. Buddy Hackett was a comedy powerhouse, wild, unpredictable, and always ready with a story. He and Johnny had a long history, often bantering like old pals on air. But Hackett's freewheeling style sometimes went too far, wandering into areas Carson didn't want touched. On more than one occasion, Hackett delivered material that pushed the boundaries of what NBC was comfortable airing. Carson's forced laughter couldn't hide the irritation in his eyes. The network loved ratings, but Carson valued control above all. If a guest kept pushing the line, they became a liability. Hackett also had a tendency to dominate the conversation. He'd launch into sprawling monologues, eating up valuable airtime and leaving Carson little room to guide the show. For a host who built his career on timing and precision, Hackett's unpredictability was both a blessing and a curse. Over time, Hackett's visits became less frequent. He wasn't officially banned, but everyone could see the writing on the wall. Carson wanted structure, Hackett wanted chaos, and in the end, Carson's preferences always won. For Hackett, it was another case of a comedian too big, Too bold and too unruly for Johnny's carefully crafted empire. Dick Gregory. Dick Gregory wasn't your average stand-up comic. He used humor as a weapon, diving headfirst into social and political issues. For Carson, who built his empire on lighthearted interviews and middle-of-the-road comedy, Gregory's approach was risky business. When Gregory appeared, he didn't shy away from heavy topics. Civil rights, inequality, politics. He put it all on the table, leaving Carson scrambling to keep things breezy. Audiences who expected an evening of laughs sometimes got a dose of hard truth instead. Carson respected Gregory's talent, but he didn't like feeling trapped in conversations he couldn't control. Behind the curtain, NBC executives grew uneasy. Carson's show thrived on universal appeal, and Gregory's sharp commentary could polarize viewers. The tension reached a point where producers stopped booking him. It wasn't that Johnny disliked Gregory personally. He just didn't want to risk turning late night into a debate stage. Gregory went on to have a legendary career as both a comedian and activist, but his absence from Carson's couch was a glaring sign of how carefully Johnny guarded his brand. For Carson, even brilliance had to come second to keeping the vibe light, safe, and under control. David Brenner. David Brenner was once one of Carson's favorite comedians. In fact, Johnny had him on dozens of times, often calling him one of the best young comics in America. But as Brenner's star rose, his relationship with Carson soured. Why? Because Brenner started acting like the show was his. Producers whispered that Brenner constantly begged to be booked, sometimes even demanding certain dates. He wanted more screen time, more exposure, and more control. Carson, who valued humility and professionalism, grew irritated with the pushiness. Things got worse when Brenner allegedly canceled appearances at the last minute or showed up unprepared. For Johnny, that was unforgivable. He expected his guests to treat the show as a privilege, not a stepping stone. As a result, Brenner's invites dried up. The man once hailed as the king of Tonight Show appearances found himself edged out. His career continued, but he never again reached the heights Carson had once given him. In Johnny's eyes, Brenner had crossed the line between ambitious and arrogant, and ambition never trumped respect. Drew Barrymore. By the late 1980s, Drew Barrymore was Hollywood's wild child. After her breakout in E.T., she grew up in the public eye, and her unpredictable antics made her both fascinating and alarming to producers. When it came to Carson, her reputation was a red flag. During her early appearances, Barrymore was charming, but as she entered her rebellious teenage years, Carson's team worried about what she might do live on air. Her reputation for shocking behavior on other shows made Johnny nervous. He prided himself on running a classy, controlled set, and Drew, at that stage of her life, represented the opposite. Reports suggest Carson simply stopped inviting her. It wasn't that he disliked her personally, it was that the risk outweighed the reward. A single unpredictable stunt could tarnish the carefully managed image he had built for decades. Barrymore, of course, survived the rough years and reinvented herself into a respected actress and talk show host. But during Carson's reign, she was too unpredictable to handle. For Johnny, it was simple. Better to avoid a storm than let one explode in front of millions. Kiss. Rock band Kiss was built on chaos. Explosions, face paint, outrageous costumes. Every performance was a spectacle. But for Carson, that spectacle was a nightmare waiting to happen. He liked musical guests who could deliver a song, chat politely, and leave the set intact. Kiss was the opposite. When the band appeared in the late 1970s, they blew the roof off the studio, literally rattling the walls with pyrotechnics and noise. The audience went wild, but Carson's expression told the story. He wasn't amused. This wasn't his idea of entertainment, it was bedlam. Producers later admitted Carson had no interest in bringing them back. The volume, the theatrics, the unpredictability, it clashed with everything Johnny stood for. He valued polish and sophistication, while Kiss thrived on shock and rebellion. The band didn't need Carson anyway. They went on to sell millions of records and sell out arenas around the world. But their banishment was proof of Johnny's style rule. If you turned his stage into a circus, you wouldn't get a second chance. Oliver Reed. Few actors were as unpredictable as Oliver Reed. Known for his booming voice, rowdy behavior, and fondness for alcohol, Reed was a talk show booking nightmare. In Britain, he developed a reputation for causing chaos during interviews, slurring, shouting, or picking fights with hosts. Carson's producers knew his history, and Johnny himself reportedly had no interest in dealing with Reed's volatility. One bad appearance could derail an entire show, so rather than take the risk, they quietly blacklisted him. Reed's reputation followed him everywhere. In America, other hosts occasionally tried to handle him, but the results were usually messy. Carson, ever the professional, preferred to avoid disasters entirely. His ban was less about personal dislike and more about protecting his brand. Reed, of course, continued making films and causing headlines for his behavior, but Carson's couch was off limits. For Johnny, the calculation was simple. A loose cannon had no place on his stage. And with Oliver Reed, the cannon was always loaded. Johnny Carson's reign wasn't just about charm and comedy, it was about control. Guests who played along became legends, but those who crossed the line found the door slammed shut. From rock stars to rival hosts, Carson showed time and again that his stage had one rule. It belonged to him. Which of these bands surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and let's see whose name you think should have made this list.